Fire away. Who's up?
They say a lot of the time that Hashem loves us, but doesn't that give us a certain power over Hashem? Because someone who loves their children, the children almost have a certain power over their parents because they can get away with things that children wouldn't usually be able to get away with.
I think it's a misuse of the word power. If I have a goal, if I have a project, and that project involves other people, because I've chosen that project, I chose the project, when they act in certain ways, I'll respond in certain ways so as to make my project successful. Now you can say, well, since you chose that project, if he acts this way, you're going to respond that way. Does that mean he's making me respond that way? I don't think so. I've chosen to respond that way because I want my project to succeed. Power would mean that A makes B do something no matter what B wants. No matter what B wants. B can want anything he likes. A can force him to do it. That's power. But if the way in which you get leverage is only because A has chosen a project, then when he responds one way or another, it's because he has chosen to make his project successful. I wouldn't call that having power over him. Now, if you think of love on a parallel with human love, where it's an emotion, and emotions cause people to do things which intellectually they sometimes reconsider and think maybe it was a mistake, but that's not the way to think of God's emotions.
I've heard the concept of paranormal activity.
Yeah.
So, like the things you would hear on the TV, like you think, would it be real?
Okay, there's a very, very important middle ground that you have to try to find and to sit in solidly. Many people get pushed to one side or the other, even people who I think should know better. You want to say on the one hand, of course it's possible. All of it is possible. God's running the world, and God is unlimited in power. He can make anything he wants happen. If he wanted that, he could certainly make it happen. One shouldn't oppose the paranormal on the grounds that it's impossible. From a religious point of view, that would be just ridiculous. It would be suicide. Don't put roadblocks in front of God. But having said that it's possible, there's a gigantic gap between possible and real. And if somebody wants me to convince me that it's real, he's got to give me very good evidence that it's real. Giving up that it's possible is giving up very, very little. There's an infinity of things that are possible that aren't real. Now, you talk about looking real, well, you have to do some really good research. You have to do some really careful research and see whether it stands up to careful thinking. Rabbi Kamenetsky, the Chonod Rocha, was once asked about a city in which there were a number of tragedies, whether they should do something special as the Jewish community to try to improve themselves and so forth and so on. And Yaakov answered, first check the statistics and see whether what has happened to you is really unusual. That's a hard-headed, rational approach. If the statistics show that something unusual has happened, so let's say there were several tragedies in the last 18 months. Yeah, but how many were there over the last 10 years? How many were there over the last 20 years? How many were there over the last 30 years? Turns out to be roughly average. So then they just bunched up right now. Then it's not unusual, and therefore there's no special signal in that. So I know of many reports of paranormal activity, also know of many attempts to show that it's real, and the vast majority of them fail. So I'm very skeptical. There's
been a few. I mean, stories of Chafetz Chaim, but that's more.
Okay, that's a little different because that's not just some fellow who's going to make a fortune. I love all these guys who write these books. How to make a fortune on the stock market. If he had used his method to make a fortune in the stock market, he wouldn't be writing a book about how to make a fortune in the stock market. He'd be spending his money in Acapulco. He wouldn't be writing a book to sell on by periodicals on the subject. It's got to be phony. So these people with all this paranormal, here you're talking about holy people and people who use their abilities to help other people. When I became religious, and people told me about miracle stories, I said, listen, I believe in Moses. I believe in Revelation at Sinai. I believe in the Shulchan Aruch, the Gemara. I believe in the Masorah. I don't need miracle stories. I don't need it. It's not. It doesn't appeal to me. I don't think my belief in the Torah is any less without it. And I was very skeptical. Because in general, I'm a very skeptical person. What changed my mind is when these things started to happen to me. And together with my skepticism, I believe in learning from experience. And, we had a very close relationship with our Rabbi, the Boston Rabbi Zatzal, for 44 years. And we interacted thousands of times. And we used to speak regularly on the telephone. Once in 44 years, he called up. It was Friday morning. And I said, Shalom, Rabbi, how's the Rabbi? And he didn't want to talk to me. Let me speak to your wife, Linda. Okay. My wife gets on the phone. He says to her, are you okay? She says, I think so. He asked her 3 times. She's okay. And with that, it was Friday. He said, okay, good Shabbos. And that was the end of the phone call. On Sunday, she had a miscarriage. And we are told that if you have a miscarriage, then the fetus dies 24 to 48 hours before. That's one telephone call in 44 years. What's the probability of getting that right by accident? It's 0. And many times, if you had made that phone call, nothing would have happened. There wouldn't have been any result. So, I think that's beyond what you normally expect. Women in our community used to ask him when they could tell other people that they were pregnant. He always said the end of the 3rd month. That was his standard reply. To one woman, he told her no. End of the 4th month, no. Came to the end of the 5th month, he said no, and then she had a miscarriage. Okay. What's the odds of getting that right by chance? They're very, very small. I have a lot of stories about him and these things, but typically in medical things. That's because he was very heavily invested in medical things. So, I think that I can attest to the fact that it happened. It happened regularly. I have friends who had even more spectacular experience with him. My good friend's wife is a midwife, and she's a labor coach. She's a labor coach, and she had dozens of cases where the baby was breech, was turned around, and the doctor was going to do a C-section, and she said, "Give me a half hour." She called the Rabbi, and in dozens of cases, the baby turned around, and the doctor said, "That close to birth, babies don't turn around. It just doesn't happen." And she saw it dozens of times. Because when she called the Rabbi did something. The baby turned around. So we have runs like this that we are confident are above and beyond that. But when they talk about reading minds and bending spoons and that sort of thing, you've heard of Uri Geller, maybe if you're interested in this stuff. He's an Israeli magician, and he claims to do paranormal material, tricks. I saw an article in a magazine called Psychology Today many years ago, written by, it was an interview with 3 magicians about Uri Geller's stuff. So they said, we've been able to reproduce about 3/4 of what he does. The interviewer said, what about the other quarter? And they said, he's a very good magician. And he's figured out tricks we don't know the secret of those tricks. But that made me very skeptical. I don't know if he was famous for bending spoons, right? So you put the spoon on a table and talk and meditate and so on, and then 5 or 10 or 15 minutes later, it would spontaneously bend into another shape, right? Well, I have to know a little bit about material science. There are materials that remember shapes, like rubber bands, right? take the rubber band and you stretch it around the package. 3 weeks later, you take it off and it shrinks back to its original shape. It remembers its shape. There are some that remember their shape only after a while. There are some that you can put them in a false position where the original shape is distorted, but then if you leave them alone, then they remember they go back to the original shape. So all you have to have is a thing like that on the table there. And when it undoes the distorting element, then it just spontaneously goes back to that. And you think, wow, that's a miracle. How did it do that? Very simple. I say he got the spoon from somebody in the audience. It's very simple to switch one spoon for another. Any magician could do that. You won't even see it. So, I'm very skeptical about this stuff. By the way, in this article, they said that they took Uri Geller and brought him to the physics department of Stanford University, and they put him in an isolation chamber, and he was still able to do it. The magicians laughed. They said, scientists are the easiest people to fool. Scientists are the easiest people to fool because scientists are trained to follow clues. They're trained to follow a trail of evidence. Magic works by laying down a false trail of evidence leading in one direction and engineering the effect in a different way altogether. So scientists are the easiest people to fool, which is a good example of the fact that don't trust a person when he's outside his expertise. And scientists are not experts in magic. There was a fellow who used to run seances. Well, he also did, things floated and so on. And he got disgusted with it, with the deception in it. And he wrote a book exposing the techniques that they used. And some of them were, hidden wires and so on and so on. And some were very brutal. A guy would go into the bathroom before the show. Another guy would go there and be talking, and the guy he's talking to was a plant. And he gets, who are you, where are you from, and so on. And in the course of talking and moving around, he filters his wallet, hands it over to the guy running the show. Says to him, there's a guy here from Ohio, from Kingston, and he's 52 years old, and his license plate, here's his license plate number, and so on. And then the guy says, I feel Ohio. I feel Ohio over there. Kingston, Ohio. Kingston, Ohio? He said, I'll bet your name is Peter Sanders, right? How does he know his name? How could he possibly know that? Because his plant got it from the guy in the bathroom. It's this kind of stuff that goes on. And they share information from state to state because they're all in cahoots with one another. It's a racket. It's really a racket. So having read enough of this stuff, I'm very skeptical about it.
So, as Jews and as rational thinkers, what's our place when we come across these people who they're like, oh, I speak in tongues, or I come from this church where we do lay on hands and all this. Like, is there a response, or are we just like, okay, that's nice for you, I'm just going to keep going?
I think it is. I'm an open-minded person, and I'm always prepared to learn things about the world I didn't know. And since I believe in an all-powerful God, there's no limit to what could be true, but I want good reason to think that is in fact true. I'll tell you where this came up in a very painful way. There's something called facilitated communication. Facilitated communication. In practice, where it became difficult is where it was used with autistic people. It wasn't designed for autistic people, but it used for autistic people who don't speak, don't write. And here's what you have. You have a board on which there are letters. Someone holds the elbow of the autistic person, and the autistic person points to letters and spells out a message. And in that way, you're supposed to be able to communicate with these people. You talk to them, you hold the elbow, and then it points out the message. Well, did they get messages? Your grandmother came to me from the grave and told me that if you don't keep Shabbos, she's going to curse you forever. And, things like that. Now, is it genuine? Isn't it genuine? So there was a whole school. It was originated in Australia. Does that disqualify it automatically? I don't know. And then there was a school in Rochester, New York, where they were training people to do this. And one of the things that came out in the American courts was that children accused their parents of abuse. So then the courts had to determine, does this count as evidence? Shall we prosecute the parents and convict them of abuse? If the evidence of the abuse is communicated in this way. So the courts demanded information about the kinds of tests that were done, and the courts determined that it's not evidence. A lot of tests were done, and the tests were all negative. The only tests that were done were all negative. So it became discredited. Now, there's a fellow named Herschel Fried. Herschel Fried founded the main school of dealing with learning disabilities here in Yerushalayim, and he's helped to establish schools all over the world. He's a Hesed, I forget which group he belongs to, and he happens to have a PhD in psychology. And when this was hot stuff, he wrote a paper on it, and he said, look, I am a believing Jew. I have an obligation to believe in everything that's taught by Moshe Rabbeinu and everything that's taught by the rabbis. And I accept all of that. Anything else, I want proof. I don't have an obligation to believe what somebody says on the street corner. That's not a Jewish obligation. So I want proof. And he went through 25 pages explaining why the materials that are put forward in favor of this idea are simply incorrect, inappropriate.
What happens when there is proof but we can't believe it? Because it contradicts with what we believe in.
There wouldn't be any such thing. There wouldn't be any such thing. We're talking about paranormal activity. Paranormal activity, there would be no such thing because we believe that there can be evil paranormal activity. Evil. We believe there are evil people who can know secrets. So that's not going to contradict anything we believe. If an evil person does, we believe that a false prophet can do miracles and still be a false prophet. So it's not going to contradict anything that we believe.
Black magic is like today.
I'm inclined to think that black magic is phony. I want good evidence that it's so. But if it were so, it wouldn't have anything. I mean, the Torah itself says that there will be prophets who will do, false prophets who will do miracles, and who say, Kosh Baruch Hu, I'm testing you to see whether you go after miracles. The fact that a person does a miracle doesn't mean he's a prophet. Not in our set of rules. So he reviewed this material, and he said the material is not reasonable. And if somebody says that he's doing it, has done it, I say to him, if I see the proof of it, then it'll be interesting. I may have to conclude that you're a false prophet and kill you, but other than that, I have no particular stake in its coming out one way or another.
Right.
So I don't think we have to. So I spoke about this when this was a hot subject, and I recorded. Then I went to a certain city outside the land of Israel, and there's someone there who heard that I'd spoken about it, and he wanted to meet with me, and I saw him, and he pledged allegiance to this, facilitated communication, and other things, which were painfully silly, and I indicated I thought it was rubbish. Later on, he gave a lecture, and someone sent me the tape recording of the lecture, in which he said, you see, that's what can happen to a person who wants to be a loyal Jew and has a university education, and that spoils him. Because Gottlieb rejects the possibility of these things. And that's because he's been prejudiced by a university education. Now, I've already told you the right position. I don't reject this possibility. If you believe in an all-powerful God, you can't say anything's impossible. God can do anything he wants. But there's a gigantic gap between possible and real. My attitude towards these things, of course they're possible. They're just not real, or I have no good reason to think they're real because there's no good evidence that they're real. That, I think, is the right position. Yeah, what else is on people's minds?
Actually, going off of what you mentioned, so earlier today we were talking about Hesed versus Din, right? So the rabbi was talking about how as various Jews in history became more holy is that they want less Hesed and more Din, so that their actions are more one for one rather than like a gimme. But that seems confusing when you're closer to God. Wouldn't you want more of the Hesed? Like, wouldn't you want that closer love with God versus the punishment?
Okay, you're asking. Oh, no, wait a second. You're asking a very good question, but the way in which the word din was used in your question don't equate din with punishment.
Okay.
Din would mean, the way you're using it, din would mean getting what I've earned and deserved and no more. But if I've earned and deserved a reward, then I expect to get that reward on the basis of din as you're using it. In other certain contexts, it isn't used that way, but the way you're using it in the question, it's limiting because I only want to get what I've earned and nothing else. But the question is really very good. In fact, it's a very sensitive way of asking the question. I've not heard anybody ask it that way before, but I think it's a very sensitive way of asking the question. What you need to appreciate is the relationship between chesed and din. Let's start this way. Chesed is a way that God deals with the world. It's a divine characteristic, so to speak. So is din. Let's ask, how are chesed and din related to one another? Is there any logical relationship between one another? Simple answer is that they contradict one another. They contradict one another straight out. Because din means I get what I've earned, what I have a right to, what I deserve, what's mine by justice. Chesed means loving kindness. Now, I can't show a friend of mine that I love him if he happens to be my employee and he works 40 hours a week and I pay him $2,000 a week on the grounds of a contract that says $50 an hour. That's not loving kindness. He earned it. I owe it to him. If I don't pay it to him, he can take me to court. In order to show him that I love him, I have to give him something he didn't deserve. He didn't earn. He has no claim on it. But then it's not justice. It's not din. So at least, now I'm putting in a crucial qualification, at least in a single interaction, chesed and din are absolute contradictories. So how does God do it? Does God sort of trade them off? Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, chesed. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, din. Shabbos, take a rest. Obviously not. There's a very intimate relationship between chesed and din, even though in a single interaction they're contradictories. There's still a very intimate relationship between them. There's a context in which chesed implies din. Even though they're contradictories, there's a context in which chesed implies din. Let me show you. What I'll tell you now is a deep piece of philosophy and Kabbalah, and it is a basis for a great deal of Jewish thought. There's a mitzvah of charity. Maimonides distinguishes 8 levels of charity. Going from bottom to top, 1 to 8. The highest level of charity is to make someone independent. Give him a job, or give him training, or give him resources to open his own business. That's the highest level of charity. Where he doesn't just get a gift, just exactly what you're talking about, right? Highest level of charity is enabled to earn what he's ultimately going to get. Because in that way, he gets the ultimate reward, but he also has his dignity. He also has his honor. He also has his self-respect. So it's a complete gift. So now, imagine Reuven is floundering. Reuven needs money, and he's in trouble. I say to Reuven, I'm going to give you a job. I don't know if you've ever known people out of work, but it's terrible. It's terrible. Someone who gives him a job, saving his life. He's full of gratitude. But at the end of the week, when he gets paid, he earned it. He earned it. The gratitude for the job is gratitude without embarrassment. Gratitude without failure. Because if it's a normal job, if he's paid $2,000 at the end of the week for working, he's earned for his employer $10,000. That's why he pays him $2,000. Right? It's profitable for both sides. So, giving the job is loving kindness. is chesed. But what do you give when you give a job? When you give a job, you set up a relationship of din, a relationship of strict justice. The chesed is in setting up a continuing relationship of strict din. Okay? That's the first level of chesed, where chesed wants to provide the highest quality gift. The highest quality gift is a gift that carries no embarrassment, retains a person's honor and self-respect, and therefore it gives a gift that's earned. However, if you strictly apply that, how many people are going to earn it? How many people are going to succeed? Very few. In Midrash, I talk about this. So God has a two-level approach, a two-tiered approach. One is strict judgment, strict justice, din, for those who can achieve it, which is the highest level of chesed, the most complete level of chesed. For those who can't, there's leeway to be given a gift. Although when you're given a gift, you know very well you didn't earn it, and you therefore do have some embarrassment. You do have some feeling that I'm not functioning on my own. Still, that's a secondary. So yes, a person would like to graduate to the highest level of chesed, the original chesed, where he draws close to God because of strict justice, because the strict justice is an expression of chesed also. So your intuition was 100% correct. When you're drawing close to God, you're drawing close to His chesed. His chesed is more fundamental about Him than anything else. But there are two applications of chesed. And if you're on the lower level, you're getting the chesed of a handout. Maybe the higher level, you're getting the chesed of strict justice. Okay?
Each time of the day is broken up into chesed and
Yes, the day is broken up into those times because there has to be a balance between them in running the world. And there are times, well, it may say something now that's a little shocking. Sometimes I say an idea and some people say, but Christianity says that. Well, we are not anti-Christianity. That's not our definition. We're not anti-anything. We are what we are. If somebody else happens to agree with us, congratulations. Then they got something right. It doesn't bother us that they agree. Now, in the Far East, there's something called the Yin and Yang symbol, where you have two realms, Yin and Yang, and then within each, there's an appearance of the other. I think that from our point of view, that's pretty profound. Nothing is really pure. Chesed contains within it elements of din. Din contains within it elements of chesed. Everything is intermingled with everything else. There's nothing that is wholly one-dimensional, wholly pure, of pure application of one. So that being the case, we're going to find elements of din and chesed. We're going to find elements of chesed and din, and that's the most perfect way in which the world runs is where the two of them work together in a certain partnership. Abraham represented chesed, Isaac represented din, and Yaakov represented an amalgam of the two, and Yaakov is considered the most shalem of the three.
So what's Yaakov?
Sorry?
What's the name of?
What he represents? It's either Tiferes, or Emes, or Norah, has different titles.
But they're all connected?
Which all are connected? The three of them.
All of what Yaakov, Emes, and Gvura and...
Well, Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes. So Chesed is Abraham, Gvura is Isaac, and Tiferes is Yaakov. Now they say that Yaakov is a kind of combination of Abraham and Isaac. I'll tell you, I sweated with that for years. What kind of combination is that? And I thought of a dozen models, and none of them worked. I was talking about this with my oldest son, who is very smart, and he knows a lot more than I do. And he said to me, Abba, the reason why you're having trouble making models of this combination is because you're using physical models and philosophical models. You need a Torah model. It's a Torah concept. It's got to be based on a Torah model. I said, gosh, that's logical. I hear that. And he said, well, I have one for you. And he took it from Sforim. There are times when you have a principle that needs to be in action, needs to do something, but it also needs to have its action hidden. So it hides behind another principle. In the forefront, the superficial observer sees the second one operating. And he sees it operating in terms of its own character. What he doesn't realize is that over the long term, the way it operates, when it operates, the thing it operates on, contributes to a project that the visible principle doesn't have as part of its definition. So let's say you see a grown man slap a young boy. What is he doing? It's abuse. You're going to call a social worker, the police, so on and so on. Then you find out that I won't say it the way I would say it because today's ideas are polluted and prejudiced. Then you find out that the older man is a psychologist. And the boy has self-destructive tendencies. And he's been trained in a certain sort of therapy. And this is the kind of therapy that's necessary for this child. Oh, well, then the slap takes on an entirely different picture. Now, it may be that crucial to the therapy is that the child thinks that the adult hates him. That may be crucial to the therapy. So the adult puts on a mask of hating him, of abusing him, but it's for the sake of therapy. But in order for the therapy to work, the child, for example, we have in our literature the idea that getting angry is something that's absolutely a failure. One should never get angry. But there are times when you should exhibit anger. Act it out. Sometimes you don't act out anger. You don't communicate how serious the thing is to the other side. How do you communicate to your child not to run across the street without looking both ways? How do you communicate that? Well, you'd like to frighten him, frankly. So if you exhibit anger, all the time being careful that inside you're calm. But if you exhibit anger, so what are you doing? You're putting on a false face of anger for the sake of helping to save the child's life. So there are times when a principle is operating. But if I say to the child, gee, you know, what you're doing is really dangerous. And I want you to be more careful next time. He's not going to get it. He's not going to get it. I know these old people, you know, they have false, imaginary fears and so on and so on. Children have all sorts of, you're probably not so much distant from that period of time, which you also had such ideas, maybe your younger siblings, so you can still see this going on. So you have, so that in the way God runs the world, there are times like that also. There are times where a certain principle needs to express itself, but it can't express itself openly and obviously. So it clothes itself, that's the Kabbalistic term, it clothes itself in another principle and uses that second principle as a front so as to hide its operation. And that, said my son, is the way in which Hesed and Gvura, or Hesed and Din, those are words for the same area, operate together in Yaakov. It's not Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday against Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it's not just doing the two of them together, one with the right hand, one with the left hand. It's where Chesed operates, but it operates behind a veil of Gvura or Din, and in that way, the Gvura and Din can accomplish its purpose, but it can accomplish the purpose of ultimately pushing forward the plan that Chesed has for the situation. So that's roughly what's going on in Yaakov. Now, having said all of that, I'll tell you one more thing. It's something that's also bothered me for a long, long time. Abraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Din, and Yaakov is Tiferes, combination. By the way, I think it's very important that Yaakov saw both his father and grandfather. Yaakov, if I'm not remember correctly, was 17 years old when Abraham died. It means he could receive the Chesed from Abraham directly. He could receive the Gvura from Yitzchak directly, and he could combine them in himself. But the ideal is the combination. Okay, so now, what should we be? How should we apply it? simple idea is, well, Yaakov made the amalgamation. He did it. He put them together. So now, that's what a Jew should strive for. Jew should strive for a balanced life where he amalgamates Chesed and Din in the appropriate proportion. But literature doesn't say that. Indeed, it talks about each person's Shorish Neshama, the root of his soul. And it says that at any given time in Jewish history, some people's souls come from Abraham, some people's souls come from Isaac, and some people's souls come from Jacob. So I asked myself, why is that? Now that Jacob is in the world, now that Jacob is a reality, why shouldn't everybody be modeled after Jacob? Now I realized what the answer is. And I checked it with scholars, and they agreed with me. The answer is that it isn't as if Jacob made it and set it as a reality in the world. The amalgamating of Chesed and Din into Tiferes is a continuous process. It's a continuous process. There have to be Abraham's souls and Isaac's souls in the generation, so that the Jacob souls in the generation can take the Abraham reality and the Isaac reality and meld it together into the Jacob reality. It's a continuous process. And that's why you find differences in the way people apply the Torah, or differences in the way they set priorities for applying the Torah. And sometimes you find extreme examples, because there have to be these raw elements so that, in total, putting the whole thing together as a social product, there can be appropriate balance.
And there are more also concepts, like there was more than that. There's 10. So, I mean, there's more.
I'll tell you. So I said about 5 minutes ago, and the recording will bear me out. I said Chesed Gevura or Chesed and Din. I said Din and Gevura are both words for the same general position. There is a trio called Chesed, Din, and Rachamim. Chesed, Din, and Rachamim are not, well, sometimes they are used not as particular characteristics, but as types of characteristics. It's the form of a trio where one is giving, one is withholding on the basis of strict desert, and the third is a combination. Those trios repeat over and over again. There isn't just one such trio. In the structure of 10, which you were thinking of, there are three of those trios, and maybe more, depending upon how you count. So Chesed, Din, and Rachamim just stands for the general form of a trio. Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes are one of the trios. Netzach, Hod, Yesod is another one of those trios. Chacham, Bin, and Das is another one of those trios. And there may be more, depending upon how you count. So when you talk about Chesed and Rachamim, the way you think about them is general characteristics of giving, withholding on the basis of strict justice, and combining the two. That way, that there's three categories, and of course, there are many applications of those categories.
Is David part of one of those?
There's a general distinction between characteristics which provide, which affect, which cause, on the basis of their own character, and principles that just receive. They receive inputs from above. On their own, they have nothing. And what they typically do is they receive inputs from above and communicate it someplace below, out of the picture. Malchus is the second type. And David represents that. The Kabbalistic description of Malchus, Les Migar Meklum. On its own, it has nothing. It's a shell, and things pass through the shell. They pass through the shell to recipients. But it doesn't change the output in any way. The output is delivered to it. All it does is assign the output to the appropriate recipients. That's David. Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes, the three characteristics of the patriarchs, are all giving characteristics, all providing characteristics. But in the structure of things, there's also a characteristic that receives and distributes to the ultimate address according to what they deserve. That's Malchus. So he, he definitely has a role, but it's lower down, closer to us.
We can't say who is better or whatever.
No, you can't say who's better, who's worse. They all have different roles, and let's see if I can give you a good example. Well, here's a good example. My son uses in his shiurim. You have a teacher and you have students. Now, when the teacher walks into the room, the students get up to show him respect. That's our students, where things are done right. Not the university where they're, throwing spitballs at each other and, texting each other and so on and so on. Thank God I got out before that sort of thing happened. Okay, so the students get up to show respect for the teacher. The teacher knows more than they do. But what's the purpose of having a school? Isn't the purpose of having a school to teach the students? Isn't that why there's a school? School's there to teach the students. So who's in the limelight over here? Who's the one who carries the higher position? The teacher or the students? I don't think you can answer that question simply and say one and not the other. If you talk about who deserves respect for his knowledge, the teacher. If you talked about the one for whom the whole institution is set up, it's the students. Now, the same thing is going on. It's not exactly the same content, but it's the same type of relationship between those characteristics that provide, as I said, on the one hand, and in this case that we've been talking about, though I'm cutting out a lot, it's Hesed, Gvura, Tiferes, 3 patriarchs, and the one who assigns it to the ultimate address, but has no character of his own to provide. What's the purpose of the whole exercise? The purpose of the whole exercise is to have effect on those addresses, those ultimate addresses. They are the ultimate target of the entire process. Of course, in the quality of being, the divine characteristics are divine. And the targets are creatures, finite creatures. But the whole purpose of the setup is to affect those finite creatures in a certain way. So each one has his own status in that way.
I have one, but this is just in a different direction.
Yeah.
So it seems, historically speaking, that Jewish couples know each other for a very short amount of time before marrying, and yet seem to have very long and prosperous marriages. Opposed to in the secular world, people will have very long relationships and typically short marriages. Is there some kind of philosophy behind that explains that sort of phenomenon? It just seems counterintuitive to a lot of modern people.
Yeah, there is, and it would take more than the amount of time that I have left to do it justice, and I have done it many times, and it's recorded. But I'll tell you a couple of things. There's a certain strength on one side, a certain weakness on the other side. Familiarity, the kind of familiarity that you get in the secular world is fragile. It's fragile and it's misleading because, number one, it's often very superficial. And number two, it doesn't take into account the fact that people change. People necessarily change. So you meet somebody and there's an almost automatic, natural sharing of ideas and feelings, and you feel very comfortable with the person, and your responses are similar. Do those responses include responses to deep things? Do you ever talk about childhood fears? Do you ever talk about torturing spies? Do you ever talk about the danger of drug addiction? Do you talk about those things? Or do you slough them over because you're having a good time? You're going ice skating, you're going to the art museum, going dancing, and you're just having a good time. How deep does the sharing go? Number one. And number two, let's say you have ease of understanding and ease of sharing and so on and so on. Gentlemen, you will never be pregnant. you will never birth a child, and it makes a big difference. One of the jolts in secular marriages is when, after birth, suddenly the mother is very interested in the baby. And the father thinks, what happened to me? What happened to me? I'm not on the page? No? Well, she can't help it. She can't help it. The way to relate to her is to relate to the baby with her. Because she lived with it inside for 9 months. It's coming out of her body. You didn't have that experience. If you're fortunate and smart, she's suckling the baby. You don't have that. She can't go on in her relationship with you like she did before. Her life is more complicated now. If you don't prepare for that, if you don't build structures of communication on the grounds that we communicate so well anyhow, we don't have to build anything, it's just automatic, you're going to be in trouble. And life has those roadblocks in them automatically. A parent dies. Or a parent of one spouse dies, and a parent of the other spouse hasn't died. That sets up a fundamentally different reality for that. Do you have in place a structure whereby you can share the new reality, the dividing reality, since you've just been leaning on the fact that you naturally feel the same things all the time? That can lead you into terrible trouble. Now, part of the function of getting to know people before you marry them is to make sure that you share values, you share life plans, priorities, and so on and so on. But we can discover that before we meet, because people grow up in communities and they go to schools. And those communities and those schools teach certain life values. And if the child grows up and does express those values and those priorities, then you know already whether you're committed to having a large family, living in a fairly sheltered home environment, community environment, your style of Torah observance, if you have a dress code or don't have a dress code, all these things are known before you even have to meet. So then what needs to be discovered is, can we communicate? Can we understand one another? What kind of personal characteristics do I see in the other person? Now, the next step is to ask, at what age are they going to get married? If you're getting married at 28 or 30, you are a fully formed adult. And the other person is also a fully formed adult. And if you don't have a great deal in common, there's going to be stress in a relationship. But if you're both 18, you're still growing. So if you get married, you will grow together. And by growing together, you will create a common character, a common set of values, a common set of commitments. You're starting from the same foundation, and you grow together. So that already makes it much less necessary to spend 6 months getting to know the other person. Having said that, in our circles, there's quite a bit of variation. There's variation between groups, and there's even variations within groups. Hasidim tend to have very short, what you could call courtship periods, but there are always exceptions. I have a friend, Hasidis, nth generation Hasidim. His daughter went out with a boy. Usually it's 3 times or 4 times. She went out with him 10 times. 10 times. That time, the boy's representative said, been 10 times already. Don't you think she ought to make up her mind? So the father spoke to his daughter, and she said, Abba, I just don't know. I just don't know. So they communicated that back, and the other side said, fine, the next date is number 1. Starting over. And after the 15th date, she said yes, they got married. So even in our circles, where it's necessary, it can be extended longer, where the person just doesn't feel comfortable. So I think that the disparity is exaggerated, number 1. And number 2, I think you put your finger on it in the way you asked the question. Is suppose somebody has a sports car and it wins races. And somebody looks at it and says, it's great that the car wins races. But this doohickey over here, I don't think it does anything. And I think it's just extra weight. No, I suggest you just take it off. I think we would say to him, listen, this car wins races. Don't mess with the winner. If it's losing races and you want to experiment with it to change it so as to improve it, okay, fine. But it's winning the races, stick with it as it rings. We're winning the races. As you said, our marriages are much more successful than the marriages in the secular world. If you see something that we're doing that seems to be unnecessary or unnatural, I think the natural attitude ought to be, if we're winning the races, don't mess with the winner.